How did black Africans find their way to the United States of America when it was previously divided among European colonies? What were the initial hardships faced by black individuals upon their arrival in America, and what forms of cruelty were inflicted upon them? When did this dark chapter begin, and how did black Africans transform from being treated as commodities into recognized human beings? In Africa, they had families to protect and lives to lead. However, in America, they were subjected to witnessing some of the worst atrocities imaginable. So, how have the living conditions of African men, pregnant women, girls, and children evolved throughout history? They were subjected to enslavement, but as time passed, changes began to occur. Laws aimed at abolishing slavery were introduced, but the institution of domestic slavery persisted. Shockingly, even young black girls were forced to give birth at the tender age of 13 to increase the number of slaves available for labor. What were the key historical events, legislative measures, social movements, and sacrifices that shaped the course of African Americans' history? Welcome to another installment of Black Culture Diary, a channel devoted to exploring lesser-known and concealed aspects of black history, culture, arts, and lost civilizations. We delve deep into history to shed light on the richness of black culture. In this episode, we will delve into the history of African Americans, tracing their journey from their initial arrival in America to the eventual attainment of their rights. Let's embark on this historical journey. The history of African Americans began in 1619 when, for the first time, a ship carried 20 black Africans to the English-controlled colony of Virginia. During this period, the United States of America did not yet exist. The territory was under the dominion of the British, Spanish, and other European empires. These enslaved Africans were initially bound by contracts to work for a fixed term as indentured servants, but their population steadily grew. By 1760, the United States was home to approximately 760,179 African Americans, the majority of whom were either directly imported from Africa or were the offspring of enslaved mothers. Tragically, a significant setback for black Africans occurred when slavery was legalized in Virginia in 1661, extending to all English colonies by 1750, with Africans being officially regarded as inferior. Consequently, they were stripped of their rights and declared slaves by law. This marked the beginning of European traders selling Africans as slaves on ships to various parts of the world. The journey itself was marred by immense suffering, with many slaves perishing due to sickness, despair, and suicide. African Americans were forcibly put to work on plantations, primarily in the southern United States, to cultivate crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Slavery eventually became deeply entrenched in the cotton and sugar plantations of the South. There was a glimmer of hope when Thomas Jefferson passed a law in 1807 to end the slave trade. However, this only led to a surge in the domestic slave trade. Young black girls were forced into early childbirth to increase the slave population. Since capturing Africans from Africa was no longer feasible, Europeans resorted to this method to acquire more slaves. In the mid-1800s, movements advocating for the abolition of slavery emerged in both Britain and the United States. Free African Americans in the North began holding conventions, although they held varying opinions on how to address slavery and discrimination. Some advocated for slave revolts, while others believed in establishing a modern black nation in Africa. African Americans eventually founded Liberia in West Africa, foreshadowing the development of Pan-African nationalism. The American Civil War commenced in 1861. Before we continue, please take a moment to let us know if you're enjoying this video. If you are, please like and share it, and subscribe to our channel for more content on black culture, history, civilization, and the legacy of black excellence. Initially, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 stipulated an equal number of slave and free states, but this agreement was violated, leading to slavery's presence in all American territories. Abraham Lincoln's election as President of the United States in 1860, on an anti-slavery platform, triggered the Civil War. While Lincoln initially aimed to gradually emancipate slaves with compensation for slaveholders, in September 1862, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves free and redefining the Civil War as a battle to end slavery. Following the Civil War, nearly 4 million slaves were emancipated and granted citizenship and voting rights through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. However, these new rights were often ignored, particularly in the South during the Reconstruction era. Despite the leadership of educated African Americans from the North and abroad, who gradually gained political power in the South, economic pressure and violent anti-black activities, such as those carried out by the Ku Klux Klan, led to the resurgence of white supremacy and racial segregation in the Southern states in the post-Reconstruction years. World War I played a pivotal role in shaping the history of African Americans. During the war, many African Americans migrated northward due to economic depression. Thousands of black officers were commissioned to serve in labor battalions and service regiments abroad. In 1919, Marcus Garvey, a black nationalist born in Jamaica, established the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the Harlem district of New York City. With several 100,000 members, it's regarded as the largest mass movement of African Americans in the nation's history. Unfortunately, Garvey's movement came to an end when he was incarcerated and deported to his home country. The Great Depression had a profoundly devastating impact on African Americans. They endured significant job losses due to discrimination, a problem largely overlooked during the Republican administrations of the 1920s. Consequently, the African American community began to align itself with the Democratic Party, particularly in northern cities. This shift in allegiance played a pivotal role in Franklin D. Roosevelt's victory in the 1932 presidential election. His administration introduced New Deal reforms, providing affordable public housing, improved access to education, and increased job opportunities for African Americans. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 and the subsequent industrial boom effectively brought an end to the Great Depression. President Roosevelt's support enabled African Americans to secure better-paying jobs. This led to a significant migration of black Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, a period known as the Great Migration. However, this migration also sparked job competition and severe housing shortages, resulting in race riots in many areas, with the worst occurring in Detroit in June 1943. During World War II, many African American soldiers served in service units, while combat troops remained segregated. Integrated officer training was finally approved in 1949, and full integration of the armed services followed. The civil rights movement began in the 1940s and 1950s as African Americans persistently and non-violently sought equal rights. These efforts yielded various successes, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s bus boycott in Alabama in 1955-56, student sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1960, and freedom rides in Alabama and Mississippi in 1961 to challenge segregation on interstate buses. In 1964, the Freedom Now Party was established in Michigan, and the civil rights movement gained national attention in the spring of 1963 in Alabama. Within 15 years of the Supreme Court's ruling on all-white primary elections in 1944, the number of registered black voters in the South increased more than fivefold, reaching 1.25 million in 1958. The pinnacle of the civil rights movement occurred in 1963 when Martin Luther King addressed a crowd of approximately 250,000 demonstrators, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. This historic march contributed to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in voting, public accommodations, and employment. The post-civil rights era marked a turning point in African American history. In 1989, Douglas Wilder made history as the first African American elected governor in the U.S. 3 years later, Carol Moseley Braun broke another barrier by becoming the first black woman elected to the U.S. Senate. By the turn of the millennium, the number of black office holders in the United States had surged to 8,936, a remarkable increase of 7,467 since 1970. In 2001, there were 484 black mayors and 39 members of Congress who formed the Congressional Black Caucus, a powerful political force dedicated to championing the needs and concerns of African Americans. Perhaps the most historic moment came in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected as the first black US president, enjoying overwhelming support from African American voters. This marked a landmark moment in American history, signaling a new era of hope and progress for African Americans. This period is also characterized by the New Great Migration, during which millions of African Americans returned to the South, including states like Texas, Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, in search of better economic opportunities in desegregated cities. At this juncture, black African Americans possessed all the rights bestowed upon them by the Constitution of the United States, mirroring those of white citizens. However, the journey from being slaves by law to becoming full citizens of the same state where their ancestors were enslaved has been a challenging and complex one. The history of exploited African Americans is undoubtedly significant and has seen remarkable progress, but many argue that it remains incomplete. The term African American itself raises questions about the perception of black individuals as full citizens with origins in America, rather than being continually associated with Africa. If you'd like to watch more videos like this one, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon. We are committed to sharing content that delves into the often overlooked aspects of black culture, civilization, history, and the evidence highlighting black excellence. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next video.